We're going to have Lamar Giles on here in March, which is going to be very exciting. I've got his new book, The Last Day of Summer, sitting on my to be read pile. I can't wait to get started with it.
Yeah.
He is one of the founding members of We Need Diverse Books. And that organization exists, of course, because we need diverse books in traditional publishing. Traditional publishing, like many American institutions, certainly not alone, does not have a great track record of inclusivity. So when you are, what are you seeing publishers doing to increase the diversity in the books that they're offering? And what are you personally doing to increase the diversity in the books that are being offered?
Sure. So one thing I think is really important to emphasize for writers, if they don't know it already, is that books by underrepresented voices from underrepresented points of view and about a diverse cast are absolutely desired by agents and publishers. I don't know if this is the right phrase, but it broke my heart when I realized that there were all these writers out there who, because I hadn't said explicitly for a while on Twitter that I was looking for diverse voices, didn't think I was interested in their work. And that just killed me. So I think if you don't know that already, yes, agents are interested. I'm interested. We're actively looking. It's a big part of my list. And publishers are too. So movements like We Need Diverse Books have, done so much incredible work in terms of changing the perception of what's in demand. And I think that they have been instrumental in, changes that have led to the New York Times bestseller list being, filled with women of color, which is absolutely amazing. That said, and I think that the We Need Diverse Books founders would probably agree with this, publishing has a long way to go. It's still overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly cisgendered, and I think that what industry professionals like myself and my colleagues need to be doing, apart from supporting and getting behind underrepresented voices and authors, is also supporting and getting behind and making space for people in the industry of color. Publishing's history in New York, at least, is very much a white, waspy, aristocratic industry. It's like, I'll go into books because I don't need to make money, but this seems fun and artsy, and it's a very white industry historically. And though there's been increased awareness, change is still slow to happen. So what I do as an agent is, first and foremost, if I'm asked to participate, say, in a panel, and everyone on the panel is white, I defer. I don't agree to go on it. What I do is I suggest one of my colleagues who's not a white guy or a white woman, in fact. So that's one thing I think is really important. I think in terms of how we support things on social media, this is a very small thing, but my personal philosophy is to just boost. So I just retweet. I retweet the We Need Diverse Books tweets and posts. I try and support not only my own authors, but other authors of color. I think that's a really important thing for us to do. That's a very small thing. But I think probably the biggest thing that people like me who aren't in management positions can do is to really advocate to management the hiring and support of non-white people. Because I think that publishing isn't going to really change if all the editorial board meetings are filled up with mostly or entirely with white people, and if the majority of the top tier bosses are all white guys. I don't think there's anything wrong with being a white guy, but if those are the only voices in the room, that's going to affect the way things are bought and publicized and thought of. There's just no question about it. And then the final thing I'll say is I think that it's really important, and a lot of people get this, and I'm certainly saying nothing new, but it's really important to be very aware of tokenism. So, for instance, there's a lot of demand for diversity, right, in publishing, particularly in YA. I once had an editor, tell me, well, I liked this book, but we've also got this book by this other Indian author, as if we've got our Indian author already, right?
And you wouldn't hear that comment about a white author. No, 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 too many white people coming out this year. We
Yeah,
can't do that.
Could you imagine if someone said, well, we've already got a book about, a white girl meeting a guy a white boy on a beach. Like, we can't do another one of those. Like, oh my God, So I think that's something to be aware of. Like, within the fervor of, we want diverse books, we want diverse voices. It's not enough to just get your one person and then say, look at us, look what we did. It's about different kinds of stories, different kinds of perspectives. I don't necessarily, I definitely don't think that writers of color are obligated to tell certain kinds of stories. So remembering that as we acquire and build our lists, I think, is really important. So these are some of the things I think that people like me can do, that I try to do. But when it comes to writers, I guess my first word of advice is just, if you don't feel in demand, if you don't feel like your book is going to be of interest, it's not true. It definitely is. Yeah.
And obviously, it still has to be a well-crafted story. It still has to transport the reader and be able to compete in the market as an excellent book. Another question I wanted to ask on the back of that is that you are not a 17-year-old girl. As I mentioned, I write books about detectives, so I'm very observant about these details. But you wrote Cherry Money Baby, which is, I believe, from the first-person perspective of a 17-year-old girl. Am I right on that, or am I misremembering as the third person?
It is third person, but I don't blame you, because as you said that, I was like, oh, wait, is it? I forgot to. No,
It feels very close, that the author obviously knows the character.
Very close third person.
And has a great deal of affection. I've written, I mentioned Banneker, I've also written All Right Now. The premise of that one I always found fun, is I thought, what if my father-in-law was in the zombie apocalypse and surrounded by just the craziest church of white people. So it would just be conflict within conflict. So obviously I have no issues with going out and tackling a voice that's very much different than my own. I feel that that's what being an author is about. Why are we doing this if not to empathize and see the world through the perspective of a different character? But what are your thoughts and tips for authors that want to write from different perspectives? And what, if any, have you encountered might be limitations for that author when they go to the market? At one point, and I've got a whole post on this I'll link to in the show notes, about diversity in traditional publishing that's, I think, 4 or 5 years old now, more than that, 6 or 7. So the industry has changed dramatically since that time. But I was told point blank by someone who will remain nameless that we might have better chance of publishing Banneker Bones and the Giant Robot Bees if my character were white. And that was my line in the sand. I said, nope, we're done. We can't have a serious conversation past that. So what are the conflicts that authors can expect to have, if any? And what tips would you have for authors that do want to write through a voice that's different than their own?
That's a really big question. I think that, the first thing I think that's important, I've addressed rooms full of exclusively white writers on this topic, and there's something that I often say in those situations, which is that as writers, I think that it's our job to imagine perspectives that aren't our own. So maybe I've never been in a car crash, but I can write a scene about being in a car crash. But there is limits to all of our experiences and understanding, and I think that it's, in addition to being empathetic creators, we have to be empathetic people and understand that there are certain experiences of life that we might just not understand, or we might make mistakes about because of our inherent biases. So, as a writer, I believe it's your job to bring some form of pleasure or meaning into the world. So that also takes with it a lot of responsibility. So I think that it's really your job as a writer, if you are going to be writing from a perspective that's not your own, or about, events in your life that A, aren't your own, and B, are incredibly charged and could be potentially really painful and emotionally hurtful to people who have gone through those experiences when they're represented wrong. It's really your job as the writer to, first of all, listen, do your research. And also, I think that the practice of sensitivity readers is a really great one. Not for the purpose of covering your butt, but for the purpose of learning and, becoming a better writer and avoiding, your own blind spots. I'll give you an example from my own experience. So, right now, two of my authors, Lynn Mayatani and Courtney Alameda, are working on a book set in Japan. It's called Seven Deadly Shadows. It's going to come out next year. And the main character is Japanese. Lynn's background is she's a Japanese American. And when I was reading and reviewing the first version of that novel, one of my critiques was like, oh, this character, why doesn't she stand up to these bullies in this scene? Or why doesn't she stand up to her teacher? And I was getting very specific about like sort of her proactivity and these little just character details that had nothing to do with culture as far as I knew. And Lynn, bless her, very graciously came to me and said, like, John, there's something that you don't understand about the difference between American culture and Japanese culture and the way this moment would play out. Like what you're talking about is from a very American perspective because of X, Y, and Z, and in Japan it would be different because of these reasons. I had no idea, and so my edits were wrong, were just off because I have blind spots. So I'm very fortunate to have a client who was able to sort of break it down for me and help me, understand. I think we all have our blind spots, so I think that we should be cautious and aware of that as we go forward in our creative life, because the consequence is to potentially, unintentionally perhaps create something that can cause pain or misinterpretation among others. So that's why I feel like it's really sort of a responsibility to do that research and to get it right. Your mind is free, and if you have hands and a computer to write with, you can write any kind of story that you want. But I think especially when we're, writing stories for children, we have to be extra conscious of the messages we're sending, even the ones we don't realize we're sending, which is why I think this stuff is so vital. Even while, our imaginations are free, but we want, once we're bringing those stories out into the world where they're affecting people, we want to be more conscientious. And I think that that's, really important.